Brian Singerman, who is a perfect person to ask about the IPO environment. You have some of the biggest names expected to hit the market in the next year or so. Airbnb, Palantir. How closely are you watching the batch of unicorns that have just gone public and how the market's receiving them?
Honestly, we treat IPOs like any other financing round. So we are very, very, very long-term investors. You know, usually when we hold a stock, we're holding it for 10 to 15 years, right? And it's not necessarily the right idea for every company to IPO or even when a company should IPO. So we look at these companies and how they're performing in the public markets, but not that closely because every company's different.
So the performance of Uber and Lyft, massive money-losing companies, they burn through billions of dollars. Does that concern you about some other names out there? And I won't make the comparison to Airbnb because it's been EBITDA profitable for a few years, but doesn't concern you? You think this is a short-term thing? Or?
No, because even once these companies go public, we're still likely going to hold them for potentially years after that because there's not, again, it's going public is a singular event, but it's not the final event for us.
Now, you say you would hold them for potentially years after they
Certainly.
IPO, and what you're trying to create right now is the long-term stock exchange, which incentivizes investors to hold on to stocks for a very long time. How long is that? How long do you want?
Absolutely. That could be 10, 20, 30 years. The whole point of long-term stock exchange is to create an exchange that rewards long-term thinking, that you don't have to just manage quarterly in the future. You can manage for the long-term benefit of everybody.
Should every company get that sort of treatment?
I'm not sure, right? It's going to be useful for some companies, and it's not going to be useful for other companies, right? Probably companies that are dividending out a lot it's not going to be as useful for.
Now, what makes you think that the regular stock market is short-term focused? What indication have you received?
Every time, and I'm not a trader, and I never really follow the markets, but it does feel like every time there's a piece of news, right, a stock will either tank or go up like crazy because of a short-term piece of news, even if that's not what the long-term goals of the company are.
Right, but I think that the majority of investors, right, there's a lot of mutual funds, pension funds that hold on to stocks for the long term. You've got Warren Buffett out there. You've also got a company like Amazon that was unprofitable for a very long time, and investors were patient and waiting. So why is there need for a long-term stock exchange when, the market arguably can be pretty good at picking out these companies?
Sure. Short-term activism is also a thing, right? But if you temper that, if you say yeah, sure, short-term activism is a thing, but at least you can't generate enough voting control over a company in the short term to really tank it, that's also pretty useful.
Okay, got it. I want to move on a little bit to Bitcoin. Founders Fund made a big bet on the cryptocurrency. How do you view what's happened over the last few years? I think it was reported when Bitcoin was at the peak, and it's obviously struggled a bit since then.
We have a long-term vision for Bitcoin in terms of the storage, in terms of a better gold, a long-term holding storage facility, and I think it's proven pretty useful for that thus far. And we continue to be bullish on Bitcoin, specifically long-term.
Right, so the last year's volatility hasn't really changed?
We're long-term investors, Dierdre.
Yeah, you've used that word a few times. Let me ask you, too, about the next big idea. We just had Michael Seibel here with Y Combinator looking at the next batch of startups. He said government 2.0. He's looking for startups that address the problems that government deals with not at all or very poorly. Where do you think the next big idea is coming from?
I love the government space. To me, we absolutely want our best and brightest working on public-private partnerships with the government. We want people working on some of these hard problems that can only be tackled with joint ventures, and we're very bullish on the space. We invested in SpaceX over a decade ago. That has a very strong partnership with the government, and we're investors in a company called Dierdre right now, who's developing strong partnerships with the government as well.
And Palantir. I think you have the three big names in the space. Why are there not more names? And is it because companies are scared to get into the space, which so heavily regulated? And
that's a great question, Dierdre, and I think that more companies absolutely need to. Working with the government, the Western democratic values transcend any one administration. And this is really, really, really important. It's really important to have awesome, talented people working on things that are important for the government, regardless of what the administration currently is.
Right. And you guys were an early investor in Facebook, too. I want to talk about some of your investments that are now public companies. How do you think of how Mark Zuckerberg is handling sort of this tech backlash, and are they doing enough? And how closely do you watch the company or speak to Zuckerberg?
Very rarely, if at all. I'm not an antitrust expert. I'm not an expert on public markets. I couldn't keep up with the traders that you have on this show. And so, quite honestly, not closely at all.
And the companies that are about to go public, can you tell us anything about Airbnb's plans and how you think that the company will be received? You were telling me before this started that they're a very different company than an Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, all these companies are not the same just because they're Silicon Valley unicorns, right? And so Airbnb's core business model is awesome and extremely profitable. And I think that'll be taken pretty well by the markets.
And what about Palantir? Because so closely associated with the government and government contracts, this is sort of the first of its kind, right? So
yeah, the hard part about Palantir is that it's very difficult for them to even talk about their full business, right? Because and that makes it hard in the media. It makes it really hard to tell their story. But I hope they absolutely get a chance to do that.
Where they're going to soon, right? Or that's what we're expecting. So, you know, are there any worries or concerns you have about opening up the books? And we were just talking about government 2.0. Do you think that there's any worries on their end too about sort of opening up their contracts? Not necessarily their contracts, but giving more information. As you said, they have held a lot of it back as a private company.
And that's not necessarily just, you know, I'm part of them. I mean, a lot of the work they do is just confidential. And so I think when they're ready to open the books, they'll be ready.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much for being with us today.
Absolutely, no problem.